Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, I have the honor and privilege of having my brother, Matt Douglas from the Fatimiyya Sufi Order, back for part 2. And in part 2, Brother Matt will basically conclude his thoughts and talk about the geopolitics in Thailand, and basically talk about all the information that he's going to provide us in terms of like dealing with all of the groups in the Western world and the Western like corporatocracy in other countries that he has seen. And he will basically educate us on what insights he got from his experiences. So if you have not seen part 1, please watch part 1 before you watch this, and then watch part 2, and I will put the links in the description below. So without further ado, a very good evening and Nur alaikum to our brother Matt, please.
Nur alaikum. All right, so I want to get into, I'm actually glad you went ahead and did this now. Not just because it's like, hey, we left hanging, but, you know, and I'm wordy, and hey, so are you. But you know, I'm still in the States right now, and I'll head back to Thailand very soon. Now, one thing I want to get into, probably just kind of to expand on some things people have probably heard, but probably didn't get the, you know, all the picture. Not to say that I have a full one, just probably a wee bit better one, having been there, than someone just watching the news here. Thailand does have some very strict anti-defamation laws. Since I'm not there, and I don't know if they even apply to foreigners, and it's not to say you can't, you know, have, you know, political commentary. There's plenty of that, but you know, I need to criticize some other white folks in Thailand, and don't want them trying to pull it. And now, what people have probably heard is that there's really strict lèse majesté laws in Thailand. You can't defame royalty. And while that's true, it's only part of the picture, in the sense that there's pretty strict anti-defamation laws across the board. For example, not to say you can't make, like I said, you can still make political comments, plenty of that. So I think I'm in the safe zone, but you got to watch your butt. And for example, there was a tourist, I forget what nationality, who actually got arrested for on one of the sites. It wasn't Yelp, but it's like one of those type review sites. Posted a bad review of a hotel, of a particular hotel he stayed at, and the owner called the authorities and got him jailed for a bit. Now, granted, I think the guy was more or less telling the truth, and I think, you know, it didn't exactly stick, but I mean, they can do that, but it's not just something. So even though there are some special provisions that do apply, I'm not sure if it's to royalty in general or just to like the king and queen and past monarchs. But you know, you got to be careful. And which, one thing I've definitely learned is we kind of glorify the whole freedom of speech here, which has its place, but we fail. I think we Westerners fail to see how the whole concept of freedom of speech is a double-edged sword. And that freedom of speech in and of itself can be a weapon.
Of course.
A weapon of oppression, actually. Because, you know, I'll use a country, for example, that does have some very strict don't criticize the government laws, in terms of, like, you know, don't engage in mass protests and things. You know, another country I've been to for a few weeks, Vietnam. Keep in mind that Vietnam fought 2 wars to kick colonizers, the French, and neo-colonizers, the US, out. So what the heck are they supposed to do when you have, thanks to all the colonial plunder that France and the US have, they have more money, and you have complete freedom of speech in a place like Vietnam, then the West is going to use their money that they stole from everybody else, or off the resources they stole from everybody else, to fund people in a country like Vietnam or wherever else, okay, to toe their line.
Yes.
And they'll control, a lot of, and they'll use it to try and control the narratives to further exploit the country. So what the hell do you expect countries to do? Yeah, they censor some things. What do you expect? You cannot achieve liberation or maintain liberation playing by the colonizers' rules. And so we often fail to see that freedom of speech acts as the colonizers' rules. Whereas, in, the colonizer nations themselves, what do they get to worry about? They're in power, And people often fail to see that. Coming from the West, where it's like, yeah, you can say whatever you want. And the thing is, by and large, though, there is freedom of speech for most things, say in Thailand. Now there are, like I said, although there are strict anti-defamation laws across the board, there is a special, article in the law. It's Article 112, and everybody will often refer to it as that. It specifically says, don't defame royalty. Oftentimes, though, and that is so used by Western media to say, well, look how they are. You can't criticize, the king and blah blah blah. But with any law, you have to take a look at not just what it is on the books, and it is the Article 112 is pretty much just one or two lines. It's not a big wordy, thesis or anything. You have to also, to really understand it, you got to see how it plays out, how it's enforced. And what I've taken a look at how it's enforced, you come to the very obvious conclusion that it's kind of the government's ace in the hole card. If someone's causing a little too much trouble and we can't really get them on anything else, we'll get them on 112. And you can't blame, it's very much to go back to tie it in somewhat to discussion of, say, the Baha'is in Iran and how that narrative is blown up by the West. It is true that Iran does have an apostasy law that they will bring out, but of course you have to question, why are there only 90 Baha'is in prison? Some of which charged with this. Why aren't they just rounding up Baha'is and charging them all with apostasy? You can see they're using it to when someone's probably having a few too many dealings with Israel. This is what we pull out, okay? And it's kind of the same thing with 112. Now, that's not to say there aren't abuses of it. It's not to say that there aren't occasional harsh judges who like to swing the hammer on somebody out of a power trip. It happens. There was one guy who got several years, ended up dying in prison because he had some disease, I think it was cancer, had a hard time getting whatever treatment and ended up dying. So there are cases of it where it goes wrong. But if you actually look at the whole picture, there's the English language press in Thailand uses the same dirty tricks the press all over the world does, of counting on your short attention span.
Yes.
Okay, but they'll give you all the facts to give a balanced picture, but they'll save some of the really pertinent ones to the bottom, thinking you ain't gonna read those, and therefore you get the skewed picture they want to give you. Okay, and there are articles you can find even in these very obvious shills, Western corporate shill sites like Khasad English, Prach Thai, Bangkok Post to a large extent, the Tiger, all these, Western corporate shill sites. They'll talk about all the people who've been charged with 112 recently, and if they'll have the big one, oh, this person got 43 years, at the top, and then you start reading down, and a lot of them were found guilty and then not given anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you've been found guilty of 112. Go on, get out of here. And it's very clear that, they realized, okay, this person ain't any threat. And there is no secret, there is no 112 secret police in Thailand, okay? Trust me on this one. But nonetheless, I do need to call out a lot of the, Western media there and a lot of figures.
Please.
So I'm going to do that now. I won't get into the details on this. This is something that people who are really interested, I'll share with, over a private chat. But I did have, and I alluded to this in part one, that I did have the powers that be, sending some folks to harass me. Subtly, of course, but I figured out what they were up to. And it happened after I had called, and it was in a private email, but I basically called out someone who I was very suspicious was a gatekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
I'll get into him in a little bit. In the meantime, though, I don't want to just go after the gatekeepers because there's plenty of non-gatekeeper, very obvious shills you got to go after first. Let you look like you're just trying to, break up the supposed left. For example, and this, hey, this might have gotten me on people's radar in my classes in the previous school year. I particularly called out one news site as completely Western shilldom. It's they act like they're an independent site. They call themselves the Tiger, spelled Thaiger. Main anchorman's an Aussie, but it's very, very clear that they are, that they are, Western corporate puppets.
Of course.
For example, their main things are just a free website and a YouTube channel. Their YouTube channel only gets about 50,000 hits per episode.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you can see in their videos, even though most of them might just show the anchor and whatever field reporters are saying their thing, you can see in the background the office, and it's very clear they have a staff of at least 15 to 20 people.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly more. So therefore, I'm sorry, 50,000 hits a YouTube video is not allowing you to, one person's going to have a hard time making a living on that, much less an office staff of 15 to 20 folks that I could see. It could be more. Therefore, they're not doing it for immediate return on investment. They're doing it for long-term infiltrative purposes. And, just to give an example, okay, one story that is highly questionable that made, but was all over the Thai English press media back February, March-ish 2020, was allegedly the health minister, I forget how to pronounce his last name, his first name's Anaton, in Thailand, they'll usually just call political figures and such by their first names. But Health Minister Anaton allegedly made a tweet calling out phalangs, that's Thai for gringo, calling out, Falungs is dirty because they weren't wearing masks. Now, it was a very suspicious story to begin with because at first, as these articles came out, it was the first time I'd ever seen ever since, I'm not on Twitter, but ever since Twitter began, it was the first time that I saw articles about someone's tweet that didn't show the tweet. Eventually, after a couple days, they started showing the supposed tweet. Figuring, okay, we kind of screwed up on this one. But, and even then they were saying, well, it was traced to a computer in his office, greater office, including like his faculty and things. And you got to realize, but these articles never said how it was traced or who traced it, just it was traced. And then, but a couple months later, this piece of shit shill site known as the Tiger, the anchor, when telling some other story about the health minister that had nothing to do with this, just as well, when he isn't, he's a Nazi, when he isn't criticizing dirty Farangs, Health Minister Annington is whatever, and went on into it. But he had to take a little jab months after the fact. Now, what's really just kind of whitey victim-y bullshit that he was on is, unlike the U.S., where when, Dump started calling it China virus and stuff like that, and all Asian people had physical attacks of hate crimes rising, even a few people getting killed over it. No foreigners were attacked in Thailand over Anaton's alleged tweet. I never even got any dirty looks. Okay, so, it's so when white people in Thailand start complaining about that, I'll say it frankly, they're a bunch of whiny little bitches. And, including this anchor guy, including this Aussie anchor guy. And the real sickening irony here is that later, in that same episode, we covered a story about a guy who got arrested, a British expat, married to a Thai woman. I think it was in Rayon, which is kind of on like the southeast coast. I could be wrong, but I think it was in Rayon. But anyway, she had fallen, allegedly, off the balcony during one of their arguments. Now, when you see clips of, pictures of this guy, supposedly kneeling and seeing how, considering he's probably average height for a Brit, and considering Thai women tend to be pretty short, there's no way she just accidentally fell off that railing, but nonetheless, the cops took the time to, not bust in the door, but try and talk to the guy through the door until he, opened up the door and surrendered. Took over an hour, but they, had the patience to do it. And this story occurred less than 1 week after the video of George Floyd's murder went viral. And the guy and this anchor could not even see the irony about how here he is complaining about one political figure over a comment that didn't have any physical ramifications for any foreigners there, yet the cops were chill enough, even though it's pretty obvious the guy probably pushed his wife, preserved life enough that they waited for the guy, talked to the guy for over an hour until he calmly opened the door. So yeah, I called out this site as a bunch of goddamn Western imperialist shills, and I hold to it. Yeah. Now also, But there are also, people I suspect as gatekeepers, but again, in order to get to the gatekeeper, I got to get to another shill. Now, and I'm also going to give a little history here. Okay.
Please.
As I've talked about before, from shortly after World War II, it would have been 46. From 46 to 2016, the King of Thailand was Bhumibol Adulyadej, title of Rama 9.
Oh, it's something with the connection going on. Brother Matt, your connection is being it's having some kind of an issue. Hang on, everyone. We'll get this sorted. Just hang tight. Hang tight. Let me enter it into the chat so he can see. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, just when he starts talking about the King of Thailand, the connection gets interfered with. So let's see. Let's just wait for him to get back on. Hang tight, everyone. Okay. There we are. So apologies to the video being cut off, everyone. We're having some connection issues, so now it should be good. So the moment it got cut off was where Brother Matt Douglas was talking about the King of Thailand, and that's when the interference happened. So please, my brother, continue.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's really ironic that it happened then, because there are certain things King Bhumibol, who was on the throne from, if my dates are correct, 46 to 2016, when he passed away, was one of the most popular leaders in the world. And you'll hear a lot of good stuff. I mean, History Channel did a big documentary on him. It was pretty positive. Even a few good shots of him, really making Western reporters look stupid too. But there's one very big thing that's omitted. Now, it was obvious when I got to Thailand, for my first time in January of 18, which was a little over a year after he had passed, that people loved him. And I was asking, I forget what question I was asking my buddy in Thailand who I had known for like 20 years from back when he came to the States. He said, you can see how much the people love Rama 9. Let me tell you why. And throughout like the middle part of his reign, I think the high point was in the 70s. But what he had done is he had done a whole bunch of different land grant projects where basically, he would, go into a village. Because keep in mind, in Thailand, anything that was not officially owned by someone was considered crown property. And it basically was, okay, what do they need? And it basically do a huge land grant. giving most people 2 acres, building them, ordering a small house get built, and even sending agricultural experts to teach them, how to rice farm. Also, setting up fish ponds and giving them some basic, some starter breeding stock. So he really, a lot of people might criticize that he was rich and that there's still a lot of class system in Thailand, but the fact is that, he greatly improved the material conditions of the lower class in Thailand during his reign. And it kind of reminds me of a quote from Farrakhan where he says, don't dream of, something to the effect of, don't dream of leaving the hood, dream of making the hood a place you don't want to leave.
Yes, yes.
Now, again, is there like an unofficial kind of, class prejudice in Thailand? Sure there is, but he brought the lower classes up, even if other people still look down on him, he greatly improved their lives. So he was extremely loved, but I can't find this information in English press anywhere. And even though I knew my buddy wouldn't lie to me, still, you kind of like test it out, and you talk to people from, you end up meeting people who, are working in the touristy areas from the farm country, and you start talking about how, and I'd start talking about how, just sit off and say, oh, we got yeah, I come from a farm. I'm like, oh, was it part of Bhumibol, land grant? And they're like, yeah, I know. I probably heard that from like 15 to 20 people. I was never naysayed on it. Okay. So, it's like, okay, there's there's something the West doesn't want people to know, even though it's common knowledge in Thailand. I've run into foreigners who've been there a few years and still don't know that, it's like, well, you're probably not talking to the locals much. But, he was, for that and many other projects, he was greatly beloved. But like I said, he inherited the throne from his brother when he was 18. His brother was only like 20 or 21 at the time, and was assassinated somehow. And it's their JFK mystery. But what many Western media outlets and some particular sleaze journalists have started doing is trying to pin the murder of Ananda Mahadhan, Rama VIII, on his brother. He succeeded him, even though there's no evidence for it whatsoever. Okay, one particular piece of shit imperialist shill who really needs to, I never read Inferno, but I know people who tell a lot of lies. Dante said, they get, buried up to their neck in shit, and every time they open their mouth, more shit. This guy deserves that fate. A guy by the name of Andrew McGregor Marshall. He's one of the main journalists. I think he's banned from Thailand now for trying to insinuate this. And keep in mind, this guy, Andrew McGregor Marshall, is Scottish, a country, anyone who knows a little bit of European history knows, that has been subjugated by England, collectivized as Britain, for centuries now. And this guy never says a damn word criticizing the Windsors or the Hanovers or any even of the old lines like Stuart, but he's just hell-bent on criticizing the Chakri family, which is, the Thai royal family name. So just the fact that a Scot is doing it and not criticizing the British monarchy should be a pretty big red flag in and of itself. But when you read his articles, I mean, they're total bullshit. For example, one of the main arguments he tries to make is that, because some people were, one of the thoughts is, what if Rami was somehow, because they did own, the royal family, they own guns. what if, he was cleaning the gun or playing with it and accidentally went off? And this guy tries to say that, well, that couldn't happen because the trigger weight's too heavy. Now I've actually, the gun in question is a World War II era Colt 45. Now, I've only done a little bit of shooting. I'm not a gun aficionado. Pretty good shot with, what little experience I have. But I'm not an expert on firearms, but I got some buddies who are. And I even asked, like, what's the trigger weight on a, World War II era Colt 45? And they said for a gun of that caliber, that it's actually got a surprisingly light trigger weight. Don't carry it with the hammer off. Just don't do it. So this shill, McGregor Marshall, tries to say, well, it's got a heavy trigger weight, and therefore Rame couldn't have shot himself, but his brother must have been playing around with it and accidentally shot him. It's like, and yet the weird thing is, though, a lot of what's particularly sad is a lot of these type stories are often targeted, they're somehow pushed on social media sites towards teenagers, towards Thai teenagers. And teenagers naturally are rebellious and they want to question authority. So that kind of story appeals to them, and they don't often bother to analyze and see that it's complete bullshit. So that's, and if you see a lot of the protests that are going on, a lot of them are young, teenage, and college students, that they get through this, and it's natural for people that age to be somewhat rebellious, and that's not a bad thing, but it can be manipulated, and it is. But what I'm going to call out now is, I guess Marshall had challenged someone to a debate, and they referred him to someone else. And this is someone whose work I've seen before, and on the surface didn't look pretty good. A guy who used to write under the pen name Tony Cartalucci, whose real name is Brian Peterlik. And he only revealed his real name a couple of years ago. Now, he seems to be on the surface someone, or no, excuse me, Berletic, not Peterlik, Berletic, I think, something like that. But, he seems to be very supportive of, of the Thai government. But when you start analyzing what he's doing, it becomes very obvious that he's a gatekeeper.
Of course.
And so he had called out Marshall to a debate and was therefore, since he didn't think Marshall would do it, even though that whole thing might have been staged anyway. I actually sent him and looked up his email. I sent him one. I said, let's go. I believe I even used the frame from Tombstone. I'm your Huckleberry. And needless to say, I never got a response from him, but it was very, very soon after that I started getting the aforementioned harassment from the powers that be. So I'm gonna call this guy out a little bit, and if I'm wrong and he's just mistaken, well, he can correct some of his stuff. Somehow I don't think that's gonna happen. Yeah. But we'll give the benefit of the doubt, see what he does, For example, he talks about how he's been in Thailand for like 17 years, and that finding out about King Bhumibol's self-sufficiency economics changed his life. Now, the problem is when you listen to him talk about King Bhumibol's self-sufficiency economics, it sounds like a dead ringer for American rugged individualism. Work hard, save, invest, build, that sort of thing.
Right.
And he neglects to mention what I just mentioned before, talking about King Bhumibol, about his land grants. Bhumibol understood that if people are going to be self-sufficient, you need to give them the land and the resources to be self-sufficient, not to make them start by, selling their labor, or starving. Now, there are a lot of people, a lot of the people, the farmers are still cash poor, and they often do go off and work to try and send their children to school and things like that. But there is kind of a basis of they can always go home to the farm and eat when times get tough. And he completely leaves that out when talking about Ramanand's self-sufficiency economics. Now, he gets on some minor Thai TV programs and things like that. But, and it's just kind of a reflection of it is kind of a sad, just facet of how pervasive Western imperialism is, in that, from the Thai perspective, who grew up, hearing about Ramanand, his self-sufficiency economics, the fact that a Westerner knows about them, to some extent, probably is impressive enough, and if he leaves out some details, okay, he's still learning. But from a perspective of another Westerner who knows the Western mindset on economics that's pumped to you in school, he's leaving out some very key details of the difference.
Of course.
So that's one place where, it just is sending up the red flag to me as a gatekeeper. He also takes a nice shot at, and he said, with a lot of these type things, they'll say some things that are true, but they'll kind of not tell the full story. Another aspect,
That's how you spot them.
Yeah, exactly. So let me call out a few more of these things. Like, for example, he takes some shots at what's now defunct, but what was the old Thai Communist Party, talking about how they were basically a shill operation of the West. And, there were a lot of various people calling themselves communists who were, in fact, weren't communists and all, and were propped up by the West just to cause trouble and, make the name of communism look bad. So he'll call out the Thai Communist Party as having been that, and definitely some of them probably were. But he kind of uses that to then not talk about, as if dismissing communism itself, as being meaningless. Further, I'll give him the credit, and he went to the point of doing something that I didn't think of to do, which was call out most of the Western expats in Thailand as racist. And, well, yeah, 95+% of them are. But what he doesn't do is really explain why, or try to, since he does have somewhat of a Thai audience, he doesn't explain how and why they're racist, because it's not most of them are not although there are a few, the KKK type racist. They're the neoliberal racist. Everybody's equal because everybody's equally capable of acting like Westerners, racism. But he doesn't explain that little bit, or where the attitude is, or about how because, white folks got rich by stealing stuff from everybody else, they, there's an ingrained sense of superiority that if you're going to undo that, you can't just magically do it. You got to, do some work and get uncomfortable.
Exactly.
He won't go into any of that. And also the latest one that's just really weird, I'm still trying to I only got theories about why he might be doing it, but he's trying to call a parallel between, you know, the latest military takeovers in Thailand that I mentioned before, with the military coup that happened in Burma at the beginning of February. And these two situations are totally different. Now, he does call out Aung San Suu Kyi as a Western puppet, and she was, you know, yes, she was backed by folks like Soros and all that, but she was coming around and she was changing and starting to, also, starting to work with China, just kind of coming into her own and realizing, okay, I might not need these people, and taking some slow steps to break away from that when the coup happened, yet he won't mention any of that. Okay, now as far as the motivation behind the coup, it took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on. I actually heard it from a Burmese national. The one that made the most sense, the explanation that made the most sense is that, and I forget the name of the general who took over, but basically he was, sometime this year was coming up on forced retirement age, which would have nullified any, legal immunity he had as a member of the military, and would have put him on trial for war crimes for his role in the Rohingya genocide. Okay, so that's a pretty clear motivation of why someone would take over. But yet this guy is trying to, and yeah, when Prayut took over, yeah, he was kicking out a Western shill who was very actively a Western shill, but and knowingly doing that, very obviously. But this Burmese general clearly that wasn't his motivation, but he's trying to act like it was, as if setting up a parallel. I don't know if he's trying to, by default, make Prayut look bad, by trying to equate them, even though he's talking both of them up. And I'm not particularly sure, but it is particularly inaccurate. Especially even because initially this general took, again, I forget his name, but he actually tried to reach out, and I saw it in like a Canadian press article that's since disappeared, but he tried to reach out to the US saying, oh, we're sick of being China's puppet, blah, blah, blah. Of course, the coup happened on, I think it was February 1st. So needless to say, after what happened on January 6th, Biden couldn't exactly, say, oh, we understand, after the way he took over, it just wasn't going to fly. Exactly. Now, granted, China's just like, well, then I think he kind of ran to China, figured, whoops, bad calculation, and China's just kind of like, hey, well, it's your country, just like they were doing with Aung San Suu Kyi, letting them do their thing, not trying to interfere too much in the internal affairs. China was in the driver's seat either way. And that knowing that they could help and give a good deal, whoever was, regardless of who was in power in Burma. So I'm not sure what Verletik's motivations are for making that comparison, but it's a very inaccurate one. So I mean, for the most part, I would guess, the West tries to have tries to attack on multiple fronts. Now, obviously, they get their shills, like they get their obvious shills in Thailand who have been or who want leadership positions, such as Thaksin and Yingluck Shinawat, such as Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit, etc. But you can bet that if that fails, they'll try to appeal to Prayut or other military members or whatever, other nationalist leaders in power in the prime ministership, and appeal to the king, etc., trying to sway them over to their side. So if that happens, then they say, well, look, we had someone in there who was always helping you guys. Is kind of what I think is, why they got him in there as a gatekeeper and how they can use him. That's just speculation on my part. Again, if I'm wrong, let's see him, go and say, I maybe should have clarified a little bit of stuff on that, self-sufficiency economy video. Let me amend it. But like I said, I don't think that's going to happen. But and again, it was soon after that I got some harassment. Again, I won't go into it here. I'll let any of the powers that be watching wonder what I haven't figured out. Keep trying. And it is very sad because you have such Western corporatocracy dominating English media, and I'm sure there's plenty of Thai media, that is just, in Thai language, that is just translations of the Western shit. Not all of it, there's some nationalistic media as well there.
Oh yes.
But it's not like the stuff in Thai is without its Western tentacles reaching in. And even the a lot of just the ordinary tourists, just because that's what they see and what they hear from the media in Thailand, they buy it. And it's, as much as I like the concept of cultural diversity and cultural understanding, Whitey has really fucked up the definition of that. And you see it. For example, there was one school I taught at. It was a private school. I won't mention its name. Just say it was a private school in Bangkok that I taught at for all of one day and then quit. This was third grade level, and I quit because, among other things, the straw that broke the camel's back was one of the teachers hitting the kid in the face with a ruler. But there were also some. I was a Thai teacher, but there was a foreign teacher who was German, who in front of the class said to me as I was watching, "Oh, this is my worst class. They're awful." And these were kids who could understand English well enough that they knew just what he said. And the most shocking one, though, was the first one that happened. It's like the first one, even though it's not the worst, but was the one that was the most shocking. Now, it's pretty much kind of a common tradition in Thai schools for when the teacher enters, if they're a foreign English teacher, for them to say, all of them get up and say, "Good morning, teacher," in unison. Well, they did that. Except they didn't call me teacher. They said, "Good morning, master." And I had to keep my jaw from hitting the damn floor. Like, oh no, I'm not having little brown kids call white me master. That ain't happening. And already at that point, I'm thinking, I don't think I'm going to be lasting here. But what was funny is if I talked about the ruler incident to other white foreigners, they'd often say, "Well, that's just Thai culture." Needless to say, when I talked to the Thai, and I probably talked to close to 10 that I knew from all different, I'm not talking about a circle of 10 I know. I'm talking about 10 people I know, all from different ways. Not one of them said that. My response is ranged from, every school's different, man. I'm sorry you wound up at a bad, tried out a bad one, to, hey, good for you. To, the teacher did what? I mean, who the hell says yes? Hitting kids is part of our culture. No. Even in places where that happens more, it takes a pretty sick individual, and not to say that it doesn't happen occasionally, to actually probably call hitting children a part of culture. I don't know if I like to think of culture as a positive thing. Societal baggage, I don't think qualifies as culture to me. But the thing is, now there have been in Thailand a lot. There have been many an incident of physical abuse of students by teachers making it in the press, usually, and which is met by parents with extreme outrage. Quit doing this to you. No, you're going to stop doing this to our kids. Damn it.
Exactly.
That in of itself says this is not cultural. This is just, a practice of people in power that's getting called out. Likewise, in the States, you have, all these it's very similar to all these scandals about coaches sexually abusing, the high school or college team. It's coming out and people are saying, okay, enough. That's not culture. That's okay. A problem was under the surface, and now the culture is calling that out and saying, you're gonna knock this shit off. But to have, the other white people reduce culture to child abuse. No, that's a really warped definition of cultural diversity.
Well, there's a fine line that you're pointing out here.
Yeah. Again, I don't think, to me, culture is art. Culture is music. Culture is food.
Definitely.
Culture is how you celebrate. People treating kids like shit isn't culture.
No, that's abuse, and that needs to be called out.
Yeah. But it was kind of eye-opening how what you consider a beautiful concept of cultural diversity and understanding is warped by whiteys. And there's, there's some abuse in every society.
Yeah.
And in Thailand, some of that's coming out just the way it's coming out here in the States, and people are calling out like, no, we're sitting, no, this is going on. No, this shit ain't gonna continue. Just the way you have that here. Granted, here that's been, that's been pretty twisted by the right. I was calling out like the, Save Our Children documentaries. It's like, why are all these little images of children you're showing to portray innocence all white, when it's statistically known that it's mostly black and brown kids who are sex trafficked.
Exactly.
Just the whole, the way QAnon has, turned the protocols of the elders of Zion, basically revived that, and which is another thing, on because I definitely got, I mean, I was in, when I was teaching in Concan and Royette, I mean, it's a very red shirt area, and it kind of, because there are conflicts within every culture, but, the colonialists try to exaggerate them to weaken countries. So you'd get a lot of, and just the way there's a big, push by people, by piece of shit imperialist shows like Andrew McGregor Marshall. There definitely seems to be a QAnon style push for that same thing of defaming Raman 9. I won't even get into some of the things they said, but I had students coming to me saying this, or that about it, and I'm like, things that I'm like, what's your source for this? And they're like, oh, people say it on social media. Now, I can just kind of sum it up with you really might want to think about not believing everything you read on social media. You don't have to get into the finer points of, you shouldn't talk shit about the king or anything like that. You're just like, don't believe everything you read on social media, think about it a little bit. You think you're getting the magic, but it was often presented to me like, I know a secret, and I'm like, that's how they get you. They want to make you feel special,
That's how it works.
So there are those. There does definitely seem to be a big QAnon style operation in Thailand to target the teenage, the high school, college crowd. It's insidious.
It definitely is. And, I thank you so much, Brother Matt, because you are somebody that has actually been there and have experience living there, working there. So you have that insider experience that you're sharing with us, not only to call out all of these shills and gatekeepers, but giving us an education here in the Western world of those that don't know much about Thailand and what the English or the Western press has basically told us. So I thank you, my brother, and the audience that's listening, or if you're listening part 1 and now part 2, this is valuable information. Please share this with everybody.
And thanks. I think I'll probably end it here just because I'm kind of, I'm sure, we can do a part 3 with.
No, please take your time.
It'll be about, because we can talk about all kinds of other stuff too. I can talk about, I want to get more of a dialogue too with you, and you sharing your stuff. I know you do a series of this, with a bunch of people, so you try to give us a little more time too. So thanks, but we can dialogue a bit. Because I've spent so far a total of about 2 years in Thailand. I'll be back there very soon. I hope to travel, to some other countries as well. I definitely have a thing for wanting to visit countries that the West talks shit about and see what it's really like. Or should I say the Western media, the Western powers that be. So I'm sure there are many other stories I could tell to illustrate certain points and about how things are misunderstood. Probably enough that I won't, even with what time I spent there, I won't run out. But for now, I kind of think of I'm feeling a little empty.
Okay. Are there any,
if you have a particular question,
yes,
about Thailand, about anything else, shoot, and it might trigger something for me. So go for it.
In terms of and I thank you, my brother. It's anything in particular that you feel that needs to be talked about Thailand, because I know before we move on to part 3 in future podcasts and interviews, I want you to fully conclude your thoughts on Thailand and anything you believe that myself or the audience can benefit from, any knowledge that you have shared thus far, and anything else that you believe that we can have in our discernment and in our learning.
Well, I'd just say, this is a country that resisted colonialism, even if, they might have had to do some appeasement, some sort of bend but not break style defenses, etc. So naturally, this is going to be a country that the Western powers, whatever else they may say, are going to be pissed off at and want to bring to heel. So therefore, it's only natural that there's going to be a whole lot of bullshit said about them. It's only natural that there's going to be, very pertinent things that are omitted from Western media about them. So in general, everybody knows the Western media lies.
Definitely.
But they seem to think that it's always telling the truth when it's talking about another country. And, which is kind of sad, the Democrats and Republicans are both constantly accusing the media of lying, about the other side, and the media lying about them. Yet when it comes to other countries, they're telling the truth, see,
It's like anthrax and WMDs in Iraq, and it's so unfortunate. It's such a tragedy that you had 1 million plus Iraqis who died and suffered, still suffering to this day. You had thousands of U.S. troops killed and injured for what? Over lies, so people could make money at the top.
Okay, that triggers something for me. One other point I'll make. That could be how Thailand might be being used in this whole global scheme, and why. And this is just a theory. Because there's all kinds of shell operations that happen, and those have already pointed out. But here's one where there could be a particular reason for targeting Thailand. Okay, the border area where Thailand, what was Burma, what's now Myanmar, and Laos all come together with what's called the Golden Triangle. Nowadays, it's mostly a tourist spot. And you can go onto my Facebook and see when I took a little tour of it. But it's called the Golden Triangle because from about basically late 70s through late 90s, it was the biggest area in the world of opium processing. The legend is that it's called the Golden Triangle because, and I think this might be a bit indulged, just because drug dealers tend to like cash, but supposedly they trade gold for opium straight up gram for gram. Like I said, that part sounds a little bit indulged, but that's where the name Golden Triangle comes from. Because there were, islands in the middle of rivers and things, some of it could, was territory that's, had basically border disputes, so it could kind of be a no man's land. All controlled by a drug lord by the name of Kun Sa, who was originally a Chinese national, but now when the Burmese, the now Myanmar government got him to stop, and he's dead now, but his kids are pretty rich Burmese citizens. No, but he actually tried to basically take over the whole Chan state, which is that particular state in Myanmar.
Right.
But basically from, like I said, late 70s to late 90s, that was the the major area in the world for opium dealing and processing. And there was a decent amount of growth, even though, the place that can grow a lot more, of course, is Afghanistan. But they weren't growing too much because the Taliban shut it down. Now, a lot of sources say the Taliban have been totally corrupted to the point that they're okay with the opium dealing now. But again, the West always wants a backup. So you had, say, years ago, very soon after, conceding was right, Kun San ends up dying. Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos start kind of trying to shut things down there. And you even have, Thaksin Shinawatra in the prime ministership, who declares his war on drugs. Now, that's very, which is very odd when you think about it, because here's the Western puppet declaring the war on drugs, where it's the West. The drug trade has been what has always propped up colonialism. And so it's very odd that a quote-unquote war on drugs happened under a Western puppet in Thailand.
Of course. And it's interesting you point that out, because the Afghanistan situation, there are so many people I went to high school with, Brother Matt, here in the eastern Pennsylvania area that I went to school with, that I went to college with, that I know, and at least 9.5 out of 10 people know somebody who's overdosed on opioids, or they lost a close friend or loved one or relative. And it's all that opioids and heroin coming out of Afghanistan. So not only are they sacrificing their own troops to get this stuff here, they don't even care about their own citizens. So now you have the medical industry making money, the war occult complex making money at the expense of people on both sides. And I think that's a shame. And I thank you for exposing these criminals.
Yeah, and what I want to say on that one is, here's you have a Western puppet was actually fighting a war on drugs, and not in the not in a place like like the U.S. or another colonizer country where it's used to fuel the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
So what I wonder is if perhaps they were maybe they were just throwing Thaksin a bone. But I also have to wonder if, that operation was ordered by his Western handlers. Because by taking out the drug dealers, you're actually making room for new ones to come in.
Yeah.
Okay, now they didn't necessarily need that after taking over Afghanistan. Okay, but now that the Taliban are in control of Afghanistan again, and most sources seem to be credible, saying that it's a different Taliban and they're letting the opium stuff slide. And but let's say they change their mind or whatever, or something happens. I wouldn't be surprised if all that, because all the protests you see, you can go onto the NED website and find out they're backed. They're constantly trying to push, these Western puppets in there. And yes, some of it is just, some of it's just trying to attack China. And it's just part of a big proxy war there. But specifically, I gotta wonder if they're looking at bringing back the Golden Triangle, at least having that as a backup option. So I think that's something that everyone, because I've lived in different places in the U.S., but one of which has been like the Shenandoah Valley, including like the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. It's kind of it's not exactly coal country, but it's kind of the outskirts of coal country, and that's where that was a big area that for the opioid epidemic. I've known, not well, but I've known a few people who have died from ODing, in that area specifically. So yeah, I've known where that's, I've known people who were killed by that too. So it's not just something for people who have an interest in Thailand, or for the Thai to, be wary of what the West is doing, but, it all plays together. We all need to understand how these things work.
It's all relative because of the
Yeah.
Thailand situation, the Afghanistan situation, which is not only geopolitically affecting the world in that area, but it's also affecting the people here with all the drugs coming
Yep.
in. You and I both knowing people who have been affected by these wars and these criminals who do what they do just so they could make a buck at the expense of innocent people.
Yep.
And I thank you for that, brother Matt. I mean, is
And
there
these
anything
and these
else you'd
criminals,
like to
let's emphasize, these criminals aren't, when we talk about these criminals, we're not talking just, although they'd be on the list of people like Kunsar, El Chapo, one of them, but we're talking about people in the CIA, people in the U.S. and British governments,
Yes.
in very high positions. So, a lot of, although the closest thing we had to a socialist president in the U.S. was FDR, and he was groomed to not be who he was, and his grandfather became rich off one of the Americans in on the British opium trade in China. So there's a lot of high, the British royals have been, like the banksters and all that. They're neck deep, and a lot of them are neck deep in that trade.
You know what's interesting, brother Matt, is what is known as their predecessor to the CIA, which is the OSS, technically still exists, but it's off of the record books. So supposedly it doesn't exist anymore. But OSS is a combination of British and American operatives and intelligence that still run that empire today, just like it technically doesn't exist, but it's still there, the power structure.
It's just, it's just like colonialism. They might have switched from overt colonialism to neo-colonialism, but it's the same game. It's the same exploitation. It's the same. It's the descendant, ideological, definitely, and sometimes genetics in the people of that same group.
Still the same people doing the same things. Some things never change.
Until enough people say we're sick of this shit.
No, this has been a very enlightening conversation, and those of you in the audience that have listened to part 1 and part 2, I'm sure you took something away from this educational dialogue.
Well, I hope so.
And please, brother Matt, are there any concluding thoughts you would like to have on Thailand? And part 3, we can move on to a new subject or whatever else you would like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd definitely be cool with moving on to a new subject. At the same time, I may very well be back in Thailand by the time we do another one. Maybe not. I'll be there soon. I'm very intentionally not giving the specific return date on the air for certain reasons, but I'm sure things about Thailand or wherever I may be, if I start learning about the history of wherever I am, and I think people need to know, it'll come up, it'll weave its way in, just the way I weaved in the kind of like the parallel between Article 112 in Thailand and the apostasy law in Iran, and how they're used similarly. Things like that'll come up. So I don't think I could ever be fully done talking about Thailand, but I think I've said a lot that I can at least go, okay, let's see what kind of questions might come up. If people put comments on YouTube or Facebook or something, then maybe we can address it. And I'm sure new stories will come up, old stories I'll remember that I can relate, that'll just weave into whatever other conversation and other subject we have.
There's one question, and that is basically, how do you see Thailand now in the post-2020 world where COVID has kind of affected many countries and different systems kind of getting revamped, such as education? How do you see the education field in Thailand being affected by COVID? Like here in the US, everything is kind of going virtual now.
Yeah, well, that's happening in Thailand probably even more so. Now, granted, Thailand did a darn good job at the beginning. They had basically eliminated community transmission by May of 2020. But thanks to the protests, which were Western launched and were called for by, the person that they're grooming to basically take over Thaksin's role, Kenatan Jungrunglankit, who is basically heir to an auto parts manufacturing company, born rich kid. Who's like the American puppet on the ground there since Thaksin's in exile, was the one really more than anyone else calling for those protests. And even people who were somewhat liking his party have even admitted to me that because of those protests in Bangkok, it basically forced Thailand to call a lot of their troops who were basically, border guarding Myanmar, and to help, keep the peace during the protests, which of course Myanmar hadn't stopped community transmission, especially a few months later with the refugees pouring in even more so. But that's what allowed COVID back into Thailand. And initially, they did a very good job of quelling that. It spiked up to about 3,000 new cases per day, went down to almost 100, and then with Delta started spiking back up again. And now that's gone down, because they're getting the vaccines rolled out. They got more than half the country fully vaccinated, so it's on its way down. But I was teaching a lot online. I got a message from my students just the other day who were, saying, "Hi, how you doing?" And who were actually in the classroom. I don't know if classes at that school have fully resumed, or if they let a few kids just drop in occasionally because it's not a full class. We were, worried about potential transmissions. I don't know. I haven't found that one out yet, but they had done a very good job. But the way it spread, there was a party among a lot of elites on both the red and yellow shirt side that kind of was unmasked and things, and that got the Delta wave going. That really was the biggest fuck over Thailand got from COVID. Nonetheless, the way it spread was very odd because it kind of did like the pattern was, it didn't look like any other graph I had seen. And for my friends in Vietnam sharing statistics, Vietnam had a similar one. And keep in mind, these are countries who were kicking COVID's ass. And then you had that looked like a step like this. Okay, it was a very weird spread. And even, they shut it down twice before. And then because of this one party, apparently, among a lot of well-to-do in government, it got totally out of control. For months.
Sometimes it only takes one to mess it all up.
It possibly, but I also wonder, because it was big egg on the face of the West. That countries like Thailand, like Vietnam, like Laos, who really kicked its ass. Until Delta, I think Laos might have had 0 death from it. They've got their vaccine rollout pretty good. Laos is only a country of, I want to say about 8 million at the most. They're a small little communist country, and they were kicking its ass. And again, they got it under control twice, but then they couldn't get it under control from one party. And I'm almost wondering if there are foreign, it's speculation on my part, but I can't help but wonder if there are, foreign agents in Southeast Asia trying to spread the thing.
Of course.
Just because the WEC will look so bad.
Exactly. The next generation of warfare it's the misinformation war, which they're spreading lies like with the gatekeepers and shills like you have addressed to the audience. Second are these agents, like you said, that are around different places. And it is biological warfare, biowarfare and misinformation warfare, anything to make somebody look bad or whatever that helps their agenda.
Yeah, I don't buy necessarily that COVID was developed as a biological weapon because I think that protects the system.
No, like in terms of the agents, like
But
spreading
yes,
it.
but once it's out of the bottle, you
Yes,
know the powers that be are going to try and use it as one.
exactly. That's what I meant.
Yeah. Well, I didn't necessarily say you were. I just wanted to people listening say that we're not saying that. We're just
Yes.
saying no. No, we don't think it was a bioweapon engineered, but we know the powers that be, and they'll bloody well use it that way. So.
Of course, my brother. And, the audience listening, please, listen to our words, and what we're saying is because right now it's a time of great deception. There's a lot of lies and divisions that's going around. So please take the time to realize if you're hearing lies or anything against a certain individual or country, take the time to research it on your own. Like,
Yeah.
I wanted to have Brother Matt Douglas on because he's actually been there. He hasn't just read a book on Thailand. He's been there, he's worked there, he's lived there. So he's the perfect source, somebody who's experienced both the Western and Eastern cultures to give this point of view to the audience. And I thank you, my brother, and I look forward to having you back on for part 3 in the future. And please, any concluding thoughts for the audience before we log off for the night?
No, just again, I'm going to use a hackneyed phrase. You got to seek out stuff for yourself. Now, I know that's been, even that has been twisted a little bit in this pandemic, but there's a whole world out there we only know a little bit about, and it doesn't. If you try to stay in one little mindset, in one little corner, it just doesn't work. Things are so much more connected than that. So, I mean, if books are all you got, by all means, use them. I mean, heck, you got the internet, but if you can get out and talk to different people,
Yes.
that goes a lot further than just reading information.
Thank you. And what I took away from that is experience is the best teacher that you could have. So
Yeah.
go out and experience different peoples, different cultures, and see humanity as one family that Almighty God has put on this earth, a tapestry of different colors and patterns painted on the canvas of life and on this globe that is to be united and celebrated and not to be condemned or divided in any way. And I thank our beloved brother Matt Douglas from the Fatimiyya Sufi order, who joined us for part 2 of the series of dialogues that we plan on having in the same manner I do with Sheikh Wahid Azal. So I thank you, my brother. Much love to you. Good night, and thank you again until we come back for part 3 in the future.
All right, sounds good. Nur alaikum, bro. Nur alaikum.
Alaikum Nur.